Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. In this segment, we are delighted to bring back longtime team member of Project Censored, Professor Steve Macek. Steve is a professor of communication and media studies at North Central College outside of Chicago and serves as co-coordinator of the project's campus affiliate program. He writes frequently about censorship, First Amendment issues for Truth Out, Common Dreams, The Progressive, and many other independent outlets. Steve Macek for many, many years. Steve has contributed to Project Censored's top 25 stories and that analysis around those with Andy Lee Roth and now Shaylee Voidal. Steve also, for many years now, has spearheaded our Déjà Vu chapter, which takes a look at what's happened to previously underreported stories. And this year, in Project Censored State of the Free Press 2025, in Chapter 2, along with Nicole Mendez Villarrubia, Grace Hardy, and Olivia Rosenberg, Steve writes each year, Project Censored's top 25 story list identifies and publicizes socially and politically significant, independently produced news stories that have gone underreported by major corporate news organizations. So, Steve Macek, first of all, welcome back to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me, Mickey. It's always a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure, and it was a pleasure to read your bio this time and not have to say that you were chair of so many things and on so many other committees, and you're getting to spend some time doing some other things, including, earlier last year, you had a new book come out on the global crackdown on censorship around the world from Peter Lang that you edited with Nolan Higdon and Robin Anderson. Nolan was just on the earlier segment today in the program.
Oh, that's great.
So, you're a prolific person when it comes to cataloging all things news media censorship, highlighting the work that independent media do. Why do we do the Déjà Vu chapter, Steve? Why is this analysis significant when it comes to things like media literacy?
So it's important for, I think, a couple of reasons, especially for people who want to be media literate. But I think for me, the main reason it's important is it's historical memory that that runs counter to the erasure of the past and the whitewashing and revision of the past that so often happens in the corporate media, right? So so often the corporate media rewrite history, and by looking back at stories that the project has identified as underreported in the past, we can you have this shock of recognition that some of the issues we're coping with today have happened in the past, and that the corporate media never really provide that context when they're covering these sorts of issues. That's one reason. Second is that sometimes these stories do make their way into public discourse after independent media, alternative media have identified, have covered, important issues. They sometimes do, after the fact, get picked up by the larger establishment press. But what's interesting, I think, is that oftentimes when the establishment press does pay attention to these stories that have been neglected and ignored, they do so in a very selective way. They leave out important details, important bits of context that were included in the independent coverage of those stories. So this is why we revisit stories from previous years' top 25 censored stories list, because we want to track whether or not they are making their way into the public discourse, whether or not they're getting finally the attention they deserve. And then oftentimes as well, there are developments related to the story, factual developments related to the story, or political or social developments that are related to the story that are important for our readers to know.
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. I mean, and this is a great didactic tool for the classroom. This is a way to incorporate the context of history, why it matters, why it's important in the present, and it helps us frame and understand the present and also maybe better navigate the future or what's coming down the pike, because it reminds us of things that the corporate media often, as Gore Vidal said, we live in the United States of amnesia.
Right.
I like to add to that by saying it's hard to forget things that you weren't aware of in the first place.
In the first place, yes.
The corporate media don't always really cover a lot of these things. And of course, we we laud them when they pick up, like you suggested, when
Right.
they maybe pick up a story from, you know, like we're going to talk about one of the first stories, Steve, we're going to talk about that you wrote about is the repression of Palestinian media. That's from State of the Free Press 2023. That was a number 14 story, a top story from a couple years ago. One of the things we mentioned, Andy Roth and I, in the intro this year, was at the Park Center for the Izzy Awards. One of the recipients this past year was a Palestinian journalist, right? It was Mohammed El Kurd, who's the first Palestinian correspondent to work for The Nation in its 160-year history. And he was honored for reports on Western journalists have Palestinian blood on their hands and the right to speak for ourselves, right? So adding these kinds of particular perspectives, Lord knows, when you look at places like the New York Times, the Palestinian voices are almost never heard
Right.
directly or
Right.
never
Right.
quoted directly. And so let's riff again. El Kurd is riffing on this issue that it's like what has been happening since not just October 7, 2023, what's been happening going back decades in the region and to Palestinians is that the Western press has either turned a blind eye or has looked through a very distorted or biased frame. And one of the results of that is that many people in the United States and in parts of the West, not only might they not want to know some of the things that are happening, they're not really given adequate opportunities to know what's happening. And people like El Kurd say, look, this does mean that we have a responsibility to learn more and understand. And Steve, one of these stories here that you're going to talk about, this was published in The Intercept, published in Middle East Eye,
Jordan
and
Times. Yeah.
also Jordan Times, right? So let's talk about the repression of Palestinian media. Steve Macek.
So the story that was, identified as number 14 on the number 14 story on the State of the Free Press 2023 concerned various ways that prior even to October 7th, 2023, Palestinian media was being repressed. One of the obvious ways that they're being repressed is that Israeli soldiers, the IDF, were arresting Palestinian journalists, sometimes killing Palestinian journalists who were simply doing their jobs, reporting on usually Israeli repression of Palestinian protesters. But that wasn't the extent of it. It also incorporated, some of the especially the story in the Jordan Times, I concerned the fact that Israel, through its through this branch of the Israeli intelligence, was putting pressure on social media platforms to either block content by by Palestinians and by Palestinian journalists attempting to report on what was really happening on the repression of Palestinians by the Israeli Defense Forces, or they were they were sort of gray listing or shadow banning that content. So they allowed it to be posted, but it wasn't visible to users. And the other thing that was happening that we flagged here is that Israeli security people were using Palestinian journalists' own social media posts as evidence against them when they would detain them and try them for various sorts of crimes. So, this initial story kind of looked at all of the different ways that Israel was repressing Palestinian journalists, from outright murdering journalists to putting pressure on big tech commercial social media platforms to engage in what I know you have called censorship by proxy, right? To act in the interest of the Israeli government by banning posts by Palestinians. One of the things that was discovered by these journalists who reported the original story is that just even mentioning Zionism was considered to be hate speech by Facebook, and so they would routinely block any kind of post that mentioned Zionism in any sort of critical context. So the update is that since October 7th, 2023, we know that the situation has gotten dramatically worse. And
Oh, yes. My goodness.
the first way that it has gotten worse is that more Palestinian journalists have been murdered in this conflict than any conflict, any war for at least the past 100 years.
Well, Steve, and
Yeah,
that's the
go ahead.
Committee to Protect Journalists you're saying. And
Right,
back when you cited them in June of 24,
right.
it was over 100. It was more than 100. We
It was
believe now that
108.
it's
Yeah,
at
yeah,
least 200
right.
now. I mean,
It's
this
at
story,
least 200.
let's keep déjà vuing, right?
Right.
I mean,
No, I mean, so and there is a lot of evidence gathered by Palestinian journalists that at least a significant number of those deaths of Palestinian journalists were deliberate.
and
That the Israelis were deliberately
targeting.
targeting. So it's a tragedy that that 200 journalists have lost their lives covering the war in Gaza. But beyond that, it seems like, according to evidence that's been gathered by the Palestinian Syndicate of Journalists, that that a significant portion of those deaths were actually murders. They were that Palestinian journalists were being deliberately targeted. And that's plausible because of what we know Israel did to Al Jazeera,
Yeah.
where they shut down the offices of Al Jazeera, which is a well-respected international news network, based in the Middle East, and confiscated equipment, rousted
They
people,
banned them in the parliament.
banned them in the parliament, banned them cut off their access to Gaza and to other places. Given how little respect Israel has had for the freedom of the press, and for the
And,
rights of the journalists who work for Al Jazeera, it is not shocking. It's not implausible that they would be deliberately targeting other Palestinian journalists.
well, look, and let's not forget Shireen Abu Akleh, right?
Right.
Palestinian American
Yeah. No.
that was
No.
deliberately killed in May of 2022, right?
Right.
I mean,
Exactly.
I mean, look, and in the report you write here too, Steve. I was just going to point out because when we were talking about these numbers, there's a new report that came out of the London School of Hygiene and someone else it's in the Lancet that talks about that there's a 41 according to their records working with the Ministry of Health in Gaza. There's at least a 41% undercount.
Right. Right.
Of
Yeah. No, I mean,
casualty numbers.
it is a breathtaking, atrocious body count that,
And
by everybody's admission, includes a majority of civilians.
And none of
Um,
this is in the
yeah.
New York Times. None of
Right.
this is being is splashed around on the
I mean,
team.
as we note in the update, that from time to time, establishment news outlets like the Washington Post and so on or the New York Times will acknowledge the sheer number of of journalists who've been killed, or will acknowledge the social media censorship of Palestinian voices, but it's always in passing. It's never a kind of detailed examination. So one of the other things that's happened since October 7th, 2023, is that the level of and the rate of repression of Palestinian voices online has skyrocketed.
Shadow banning, demonetization.
Shadow
You talk about
banning, blocking of hashtags.
digital apartheid. You talk about
Right.
digital
Digital
apartheid to global
apartheid.
voices. Yeah.
Right. So yes, Global Voices, which is a very mainstream media rights and media advocacy organization that focuses on digital media around the globe and censorship of digital media around the globe, has actually said that what's happened to Palestinian voices online since October 7th, 2023, it constitutes digital apartheid. And this Palestinian-based digital rights group, Seven Amle, noted that they have received 1,400 reports of unjustified content moderation between October 7th, 2023 and November 27th, 2023. So just in the month after October 7th, there were 1,400 requests that came from Israel's cyber unit. This is the sort of branch of the Israeli intelligence that focuses on
8,200.
digital
Yeah.
communication. And that compares with, just 1,100 for the entire previous year. So there's just been this dramatic escalation and increase in the repression of Palestinian and pro-Palestinian content, on these platforms. I'll just say many of my colleagues, right, have found that if they try to post a Palestinian flag, they try to post a news story about what's happening in Gaza, an independent news story about what's happening in Gaza on Instagram or Facebook or any number of other social media platforms, they find that it is rendered invisible.
Yeah.
That actually happened to me. Just not too long ago, where people said, "I can no longer see your post," which had to do with Israel being charged with crime and Netanyahu being charged with crimes against humanity. And all of a sudden, the post is invisible. It's still there. It's still
Yeah, but it's shadow
visible to
banned.
me. It's still visible to me. Nobody can see it. And one of the ways you can tell that things are being shadow banned is if you normally make posts that say get like 20 or 30 engagements from people, and all of a sudden it drops to 0 or 1,
Yeah.
there's a chance that it has been shadow banned.
Yeah, that sort of happened to me, I think. And that leads me to one of the other stories. Speaking of canaries, a different kind of canary. This is the Canary Mission. Canary Mission blacklists. Canary Mission is an organization you're going to talk about. I just talked with ethnic studies scholar Omar Zaza from San Francisco State University, who's doing a book on censored press on sort of, again, sort of terms of servitude is the title of his book, looking at the ways in which we had things like digital apartheid, the way the U.S. and the Israeli state used technology to suppress the Palestinian people. Well, one of the components of this, Steve, is of course surveillance, and the blacklisting based on this surveillance of pro-Palestinian activists chills free speech rights. And so you have another story here from The Intercept from 2020, from The Nation from 2021. This goes back, a number of years, but the Canary Mission is still around. So what's the threat of this now, Steve, in this context?
Okay, so this story was number 6, the number 6 story in the State of the Free Press 2022 list of top underreported stories of the year. As you say, it's the story itself is based on 2 stories, one in The Intercept and one in The Nation, and it details these reports by independent media detailed the activities of this McCarthyite group, Canary Mission, who routinely publish reports about activists, scholars, and students, most of whom are critical of Israel and involved in pro-Palestinian activism, as terrorists and anti-Semites. And what Canary Mission does is not just sort of mention these people and smear them as terrorists and anti-Semites, but they deliberately try to get the targets of their smear campaigns expelled from school. If they're just recently graduated, they deliberately try to undermine their employment opportunities by contacting prospective employers. They publicize their names and sort of defame them as anti-Semites. And what business is going to want, right, to hire somebody who's been identified openly as an anti-Semite? So at the time that we first covered this, there was very little coverage in the corporate press of Canary Mission. If they're mentioned at all, they were mentioned only in passing. There was never any kind of investigation about who was funding Canary Mission, who might be directing their activities, and so on. Since this story was first flagged by Project Censored, there has been some fairly decent independent media coverage of Canary Mission. So In December 2023, The Nation published a comprehensive article by James Bamford about Canary Mission, and he also appeared on Democracy Now! To talk about how Canary Mission was going after and attempting to smear pro-Palestinian activists or critics of Israel. And a number of student newspapers have actually reported fairly heavily on this, because a lot of Canary Mission's activity is focused on trying to smear student activists
And professors.
and professors, which is a deliberate attempt to sort of chill, right, debate and
Academic
protest.
freedom. It's a violation of academic freedom.
It's a violation of academic freedom. It's a deliberate attempt to chill, dissent about the U.S. support for Israel's war in Gaza. So what is very interesting is that Bamford and some of the other student media have started drawing attention to who is supporting Canary Mission. So Bamford himself relied on a report by The Forward, which is a progressive Jewish publication, long-standing Jewish newspaper that dug into where Canary Mission gets their funding. And it turns out that Canary Mission is getting a lot of funding from some big Jewish foundations, like the Helen Diller Family Foundation, the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco, the Jewish Community Foundation of Los Angeles, who were funneling their donations to Canary Mission through an Israeli nonprofit called Megamot Shalom. And Bamford raised the question of whether or not this might be illegal, and that in that Canary Mission, the people who were funding Canary Mission were potentially committing a crime, acting as agents of a foreign power. Because so also the way that the funding, as Bamford pointed out in his Nation article, the way that the funding of Canary Mission operated, it made clear that there's good reasons to believe the charges that have long been leveled at Canary Mission, that they operate at the direction of Israeli intelligence, that they are a project of Israeli intelligence operating in the U.S., targeting, in most cases, U.S. citizens. It's incredibly alarming. And what's interesting is that there has been, aside from an article, in the Guardian, which is actually, I would consider to be also a form of independent media, because it's run by a not-for-profit. Like, there has been very little coverage of this in the corporate press.
Well, and Steve Macek, for all the hullabaloo we hear about Putin and Russia and interfering and trying to sow dissent and discord and so on, I mean, here's example after example, of the Israeli government or the IDF or Israeli intelligence or others almost nearly being caught red-handed manipulating what's going on in the
I
information.
mean, it's not proven beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's nevertheless suggestive. And the fact is, I mean,
more suggestive than Russia.
Right. The fact is that the corporate media are very selective in their outrage about foreign attempts to influence American politics.
Yeah.
They cry to the high heavens about Russia. Of course, we're all familiar with what's happening at the Supreme Court and the debate about whether or not
TikTok,
this law that Biden signed into law is going to be allowed to shut down TikTok, because it's supposedly an instrument of Chinese Chinese influence in the U.S. But there's very little outcry about Israel's influence over American politics. There's very little outcry over Saudi Arabia's influence over American politics. Saudi Arabia spends more on lobbying than just about any country. And I actually wrote about this for a dispatch that went out, a Project Censored dispatch, a couple of months ago. There's just, very little attention to all of the efforts of these deep-pocketed foreign governments who happen to be classified as our allies over our political culture and our politics. And in many cases, I think I would say that the kind of influence they exert, like the influence Saudi Arabia and Israel exert over our politics, comes close to breaking our laws,
I mean, they're
right? But
pretty
there's
extraordinary.
no attention to it.
Yeah, they're very extraordinary. And I mean, and again, we can cite the late great George Carlin to kind of frame this. Let's not have a double standard here. One standard will do just fine.
Fine, right? Exactly. Yes. No, it's true.
Pretty remarkable. Well,
Yeah,
Steve, we only have a couple minutes left in this
sure.
segment, and I know there's several other stories in the book, and we're not going to have time to get into them. One is on
Right.
femicide and the global war of violence against women. The other one, however, which is also just very relevant, is Ukrainian fascists trained U.S. white supremacists. That's another story. I mean, do you want to talk briefly about one of these in the couple minutes we have, just to give
Sure, I'll
another
talk
example?
about this story about Ukrainian fascists who training U.S. white supremacists. This was a story that the Project Censored, drew attention to back in 2018, and it's about the fact that organized, far right white supremacists in the U.S. were traveling to Ukraine to be trained by members of the right-wing Azov Battalion, which was a kind of right-wing paramilitary group in Ukraine that rose up after Ukraine's independence. That has openly celebrated Nazi, kind of Nazi figures, people who had collaborated with the Nazis in Ukraine, so on, explicitly anti-Semitic and racist, have explicitly anti-Semitic and racist ideology, and had a huge influence in the Ukrainian government back in 2018, and was actually officially incorporated. The Azov Battalion, this paramilitary group, was officially incorporated into the Ukrainian military. U.S. white supremacists were going over there and training, and then coming back with this very sophisticated knowledge of weaponry and warfare to the United States, which is terrifying. We flagged this based on some stories by Mint Press News
Right.
back in 2018. Since that time, of course, there's been a big change, which is Russia invaded Ukraine. It sparked this massive conflagration that has killed hundreds of thousands of people, displaced 10 million Ukrainians. And what's really interesting here, and this is something that Jacobin and other independent news media have drawn attention to since we first flagged this story, is that now that the U.S. is funneling all sorts of military aid to Ukraine, we've forgotten about. We've completely forgotten about
memory hold, maybe.
the Nazi. We've memory hold the Nazi connections to the Azov Battalion, and there's been an effort retroactively to whitewash this group, which had been was responsible for training U.S. white supremacists. Interestingly, there has also, there still is a flow of people from, white supremacists who are going over to volunteer to fight against Russia for Ukraine, but we are not seeing any coverage of this in the sort of, establishment commercial press.
Well, and Steve Macek, and just like when we were talking about, critiquing the Israeli government and their policies and their actions, doesn't make us anti-Semitic. Talking about what's happening in Ukraine and Azov Battalion doesn't make anybody pro-Putin.
No, in no sense of the word, right?
No.
No, it's just, and you could even make the argument, some people have, that the Azov Battalion played this really important role right after the invasion, the Russian invasion. They were the ones who defended Mariupol when there was no one else to resist the Russian incursion. But nevertheless, you have to look at their kind of, really unsavory associations, their unsavory past, the leaders' unsavory past statements. And there's lots of reasons to doubt that they are this reformed and rehabilitated organization. The communication director for Azov still has a Twitter account that is full of Nazi, swastikas and neo-Nazi symbols. It raises all sorts of questions about just how reformed they are.
Well,
But the degree to which the mainstream corporate media has been covering them, they've talked about them as sort of rehabilitated or reformed, that they've distanced themselves from their far right racist past. I don't believe that that's the case, and a lot of independent reporting seems to suggest that it isn't true.
Well, Steve Macek, unfortunately, we are out of time, even though we could go on, and we've been filling books like this for years, and you've been doing chapters on Déjà Vu with us for years on these underreported stories. It's a very important exercise in understanding historical context in the present and how censorship continues to work and function in our society. And obviously, because of the topics we talked about today, it will probably be shadow banned. And
absolutely, I'm not expecting that any of my social media followers will be able to hear this show.
We'll test that theory next week, Steve. So
all right.
At any rate, Steve Macek, professor of communications at North Central College outside of Chicago, longtime contributor to Project Censored. We've been talking about his contributions to State of the Free Press 2025 on Déjà Vu, what's happened to previously unreported stories. Steve Macek's most recent book is Censorship, Digital Media, and the Global Crackdown on Freedom of Expression, edited by Steve Macek, Robin Anderson, Nolan Higdon, out on Peter Lang. Steve Macek, as ever, it's great to catch up with you. Thank you so much for your time and for your erudite analysis.
Thank you so much. It was really great. Thanks.
Fantastic. We'll see you next time on the Project Censored Show.